All right, this will help you get ready for the Chapter 10 test coming up this week. First of all, I'm going to go through all the vocab words that are listed on there. First one is autotroph or autotroph. This is an organism that is able to capture energy from sunlight or chemicals and use it to produce its own food. So this would be, for example, a plant. Heterotrophs or heterotrophs, either way, is an organism that cannot make its own food and gets its food by consuming other living things. We then had homeostasis, which is the condition in which an organism's internal environment is kept stable in spite of changes in the external environment. So for example, the fact that your body stays at a constant temperature and has constant pH inside it or a constant amount of acid in it, that would be considered homeostasis. Multicellular is consisting of many cells. That's why it says multi. It's a fairly straightforward word if you look at the root word on it. And then we have what's called binomial nomenclature. And this is the classification system in which each organism is given a unique two-point scientific name indicating its genus and species. Binomial means bi part means two. Nomial means names. Two names, naming system. That's what nomenclature stands for, is naming system. So it's a very nice complicated word that basically says it has two names. Genus is a classification grouping consisting of a number of similar, closely related species, while species is a group of similar organisms that can mate with each other and produce offspring that can also mate and reproduce. And so what this is saying is that genus is they're pretty close together, and species means they're very, very similar. Prokaryote is a unicellular organism that lacks a nucleus and some other cell structures. And that is, remember, one of our categories of domains. We have eukaryotes, which is an organism whose cells contains a nucleus, and that's a big defining characteristic between the two different categories. Then we also have the idea of what's called convergent evolution, which is the process by which unrelated organisms evolve similar characteristics. And we're taking a look at that with the No Bones About It investigation. For the concepts, we're going to be taking a look at what is a living thing and what constitutes it being living, how we classify organisms, knowing the domain Eukarya kingdoms, or what the kingdoms are that are found with domain Eukarya, what an organism's scientific name includes, how organisms react and evolve and how scientists determine that this happened, the concepts of spontaneous generation, taxonomic keys and with what they are and why we actually use them. They're very, very easy, in fact. And then finally, how a branching tree diagram works. So we'll jump in first with what is a living thing and what constitutes it being living. And so we first have to look at this idea of what's called cellular organization, which basically means that they are organized together and the cells behave as one unit or a group of units. They also usually contain similar chemicals. We usually find there's some common chemicals, for example, DNA or deoxyribonucleic acid, that are base parts of a living thing. They all use energy in some way in order to make the cells function, and they always respond to their surroundings. There's always some kind of change, whether it be a plant growing towards sunlight or you moving your hand away from a hot burner. It all constitutes us responding to our surroundings. And they all also can grow and develop. And again, we see that with any living thing, that they grow, usually get larger, and they also develop into a more mature organism. And finally, reproduce. Now, the classification of organisms can actually be broken down into three different things. First of all, looking at what it is, then how it works, and then finally what exactly it means to classify these organisms and what it means when we look at a classification. So first, to get an understanding of what it is, we have to look at it as a way to organize and identify organisms. When I say I have a dog at home, you would probably say, well, what kind of dog? Because just knowing that you have a dog, there's a wide range. You can have one that's as small as fits in a teacup to one that is as big as a horse. They all qualify as dogs in this case. And so we need to take a look at that. And it gives us an agreed upon name to signify an organism. Helps us to see that, hey, I'm talking about this organism. I'm not talking about some other one. I'm able to be very specific about it. It also helps scientists to see what characteristics may be in common. So it kind of allows us to see that, hey, these kind of had similar things. There's some similarities between them, that they have similar body structures or something about them is the same between them. Now, when we look at the actual way it works, we actually have 8 levels of classification, and it's domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. And it does come in handy to know that it goes in that order of domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And there's a very good way to remember this. A lot of you probably already heard this in 6th grade, and it is, did King Philip come over for good spaghetti? DKP, COFGS, and you can see that it puts it automatically right in order. So you can figure out which ones go before which. Now, what we always find with these when we look at them is that the domain is the broadest level. It covers the largest area. In fact, there's only 3 domains, and everything that's alive fits in one of the 3. And so that makes it so that we actually can figure out very quickly which one's which. Then we can also see then that the species is extremely specific. When we go down to the species level, we are talking about one specific group of organisms. Now, in order to help figure that out, we have what's called the scientific name, because let's be honest, writing down the domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species for every organism, every time we talked about it, would get really, really old. And scientists figured out we can use the scientific name of just the genus and species. Because what's really cool is if you know the genus and the species, it only fits into one family, which then fits into exactly one order, which fits into exactly one class, which fits into exactly one phylum, into one kingdom, and one domain. It makes it much easier that we can just say, hey, let's just talk about the genus and the species. And this is what's called the binomial nomenclature. It's just the last 2 parts of the classification system. Whenever we write it, we always write it as genus followed by species. And you notice I have it in italics because we always write in italics, and we always capitalize the very first word. And it makes it a really easy way to say, hey, we're talking about the scientific name. So when you come across it in the textbook or in any kind of research papers or anything you may read in the future, you know immediately if this is written in italics, the first word's capitalized, the second word's not capitalized, this has to be the scientific name. Another telltale giveaway is it's always written usually in Latin. So what exactly does this mean then? Well, when 2 organisms share a level, they must have something in common. So if they share the domain Eukarya, for example, it means they both have nucleuses in their cells. It's automatic. They all have to have it if they fit in that domain. And we can also look at then the case of comparing a dog and a cat. We look at the domains are the same. The same thing with the kingdom and the phylum and the class and the order. So we can see this large area where they're all the same. And what we can see then is that we can tell that it must be an organism that has a nucleus by Eukarya. Animalia means it's an animal. Chordata, it's got a spine. Mammalia, well, it's a mammal then. In that case, it gives live birth and has milk. And then finally, the order, we know it's carnivora. That usually means carnivore, hey, that means that it eats meat. And then it actually starts to break down there. We can see there's some slight differences. Now we have the Canidae and then Felidae. And then finally we have genus Canis for the dog and genus Felis for the cat, giving us our final name or final scientific name of Canis lupus and Felis catus. But we can see that they have something in common up there at the top with the domain, kingdom, phylum, class, and order. And if you have a dog and cat at home, you can see there's a lot of similarities there in the end. They both have fur, they both have four limbs, they both have mouths that have actually some similar structure to them. The ears, the eyes are kind of mounted in the same spot. You see a lot of similarities. The next part was knowing the domain Eukarya's kingdoms. There's actually a few important ones there. Remember, Eukarya were all organisms whose cell contain a nucleus, and it includes these 4 kingdoms. Protist, which is kind of like the catch-all. Everything that doesn't fit somewhere else goes in this category. Then fungi, which are heterotrophic organisms that consume dead or decaying organisms. Basically, it means they eat other things, and usually they're dead or decaying. Plants, these are the autotrophs, or autotrophs, that they can actually make their own food. That might be an important thing for where we get all the energy from. And then finally, there are animals, which are the heterotrophic multicellular organisms. And if you take a look at it, that's the category we fit into in the domain Eukarya. Now, looking at what an organism's scientific name includes, it's, of course, as I said, based on binomial nomenclature. I've said it now like 4 times. You've got to notice it's really important. And it's always composed of the genus and the species. Remember, it specifies a single organism. So we're able to get down to the point of knowing we're talking about this specific population of organisms. And it basically simplifies communication. It lets scientists talk about things and not have to worry about, are we talking about the same thing? So you know how bad it is when you think somebody's talking about something and all of a sudden you find out, no, they're talking about something different. This allows them to not have that issue. Because common names can be confusing since a lot of animals may share the same name, and then also we run into that sometimes they have different names for different animals in different countries under different languages. Whereas if we use a scientific name, we all agree it's one thing. So like the dog, it's always Canis lupus. Don't have to worry about it. You go over to Germany, it's Canis lupus. Japan, Canis lupus. United States, Canis lupus. Makes it much, much easier for us. The same thing, for example, with the bullfrog. It's Rana castibiana. It's always the exact same name in every situation. And this is actually kind of interesting too. It's actually developed by a guy named Linnaeus. He helped develop the system a long time ago. And that's why it's written in Latin, is because that's how they always used to communicate back then. And it kind of stuck until now. Now, looking at the idea of how organisms react and evolve and how scientists determine this, we can take a look at the idea that organisms adapt over time to their surroundings so that they may survive. And so the way scientists figure this out is they looked at the organism's body structure and its different characteristics. And they can see these different changes that have occurred. And they can then make what's called a branching tree diagram to look at when these different traits appear in the process. And they can then study this and it helps them to figure out the classifications of the animals. Charles Darwin was actually one of the more influential scientists who studied this. There's been lots of other scientists, both before him and after him. He's kind of the one that kind of formalized it and brought it all together. And this comes then to the next idea we're going to talk about, which is the concept of spontaneous generation. This was based on the investigation out of thin air. We took a look at this and saw that life cannot be created out of nothing. And basically what that means is we can't get life without having life around. Non-living materials cannot produce life. So for example, the chicken broth. It is a non-living material. However, when we put it inside the container that was open, it was able to generate life, while the container that was closed, it was not able to generate life. Reddy and Pasteur both did experiments on this and figured out what was going on with it. Of course, Reddy, he did the experiment with the raw meat, and he saw that in one container it was covered, it didn't have maggots on it, whereas with the other container it was uncovered, it had maggots on it. Up until that point, people thought the maggots were in the raw meat, when meanwhile he figured out that the flies landed on it and deposited eggs, forming the maggots. Same thing with Pasteur. He saw chicken broth growing bacteria just like we saw in lab. In the closed container, he didn't see it. The open container, he had the bacteria growing. And of course, you also know Pasteur is one of the ones that he helped develop a lot of other important things to help protect us from bacteria. Now we'll move on to the idea of taxonomic keys, what they are and why we use them. They're actually a pretty simple device. You've used them before, also sometimes called a dichotomous key. And basically it's a series of yes or no questions to identify an animal. I like to think of it as a way to get an answer quickly. You can see here I have a picture of some kind of a evergreen tree that we're going to try to identify from Utah. And so we'll go through this first and we'll take a look at it. We can see that we have two choices here. Leaves are scaly-like or leaves are needle-like. And what we can notice is that the leaves in this case are needle-like. And then so we can make an observation. It says go to number 3. We go down to number 3, see if they're in bundles of 2 or more, or if they're single bundles. And we see that they are in bundles of 2 or more. And we move down again a little bit further and we see about how long they are. And I can tell you from looking at the picture, and then also from the fact that I looked up the exact one, this is a lodgepole pine because the needles are about 2 inches long. And you can see how with 3 questions we figured out what something was without really knowing a whole lot about it. Very useful. I like to think of this pretty much as a game of 20 questions in order to figure it out. See if you can get the answer in less than 20 questions. The answers are already written down for you. Very handy little tool. Finally, we need to talk about the idea of a branching tree diagram. We looked at one of these before, and we're looking at another one again here. We can see different changes. And so you can see to begin with down at the bottom, it started out with vertebrate, and the vertebrate expanded on to having all these different parts in there. So the vertebrate then moved on to the 4 limbs, and you can see then between the fish and the amphibians, we went from having no limbs to all of a sudden having 4 limbs. That was one of the changes that occurred over time. And we can see that sometimes there's splits that occur too, and they'll go off in different directions. For example, we can see that eggs with shells goes off more towards crocodiles and birds, whereas the hare and live birth goes off towards the rodents, rabbits, and primates. Now, some other things just to kind of remind you of for this test that's coming up. Always study your claims and evidence from the investigations that we did with this chapter. They are very handy to help you get ready for it. Study the vocabulary words with a friend or a parent. Always a beneficial way to make sure that you get an understanding of what they are. All the vocabulary words can and will be used in the test. Just the ones I listed are a little bit more likely to come up. So remember, anything else we've talked about, it's still fair game. And remember, there, as always, will be an applications questions on the test. So make sure you look over those so that you're ready for them as well. If you have any questions, you can jump onto My Big Campus. Be happy to answer them on there, or you can ask me in class. Good luck.